Hi. In this video I want to talk a little bit about some of the statistics on boys and reading. This is the heart of some of the work that I do and have done over the course of my career. So I want to present some findings and theories about what's going on with boys and reading. Some of this will track with the statistics I talked about on girls and women in STEM in a different video. So I suggest that you go and take a look at that to help contextualize what I'm going to talk about in this video. So first, taking a look at where the boys are in terms of the reading test, I'm using the National Assessment of Educational Progress from the U.S., which is sort of the gold standard, if you will, of reading tests. It's a national sample, and it's been administered over a number of years, so it has a lot of reliability and validity. So if we look at the last 20 years or so of the NAEP reading test, you can see on a scale of 0 to 500, which is the scale for the test, boys and girls are relatively close over time, and there's a lot of consistency in what we see over time. You'll see that the bottom two lines there are boys and girls in grade 4. The top two lines are boys and girls in grade 8. If we look a little bit more closely, if we sort of zoom the scale in, if you will, you can see that, again, there is a gap between boys and girls in both of these grades. Again, the top two in grade 8, the bottom two in grade 4, and those remain relatively consistent across time. There's no giant swings, if you will, in terms of boys' literacy scores, which is a pretty obvious answer to sometimes people saying things like that all the attention to girls has really caused boys to go down. Just the data just don't bear that out. If we look in terms of the actual gap in each of those grades, so in each year, the gap for grade 4 and the gap for grade 8, you can see that over time there is a slight increase in the gaps, both in grade 8 and grade 4. So in other words, they are going up ever so slightly. The R-square value for the gaps growing in grade 8 are actually much more predictive than the ones for grade 4, which you can see there by those vertical lines. Now, if we look at the math versus reading scores, just to kind of give us some context of how big these gaps really are, there is a gap, but to be able to say, okay, well, these are really big or really small takes kind of comparing them to some other numbers. So if we look at where the girls are in math versus where the boys are in reading, you can see there the red bars are for each year's math gaps, and you can see that those are relatively small across those years, usually right around 2, sometimes 3, and more recently down to 0 for 8th grade gaps in math. So just to contextualize the gaps that have been talked about widely for math are vastly smaller than the ones that we talk about for reading. If we look at the writing test, that's the other sort of major part of literacy, reading and writing. In 2011, which is the last time that the test was administered, the gap for grade 8 was nearly 20 points. It wasn't administered in 4th grade, and the gap for grade 12 was nearly 15 points. And now this particular test is looking at a 300-point scale. So when we looked at the reading test, that was a 500-point scale. This is a 300-point scale, and the gaps are still rather big. You can look in 2007. They were about the same, though we did have obviously made a good bit of progress in terms of the 12th grade. In grade 8, the writing scores have not improved very much from 1998 to 2011, but we have seen a pretty dramatic improvement for grade 12. So you might be wondering at this point, well, is this a recent thing? Again, is this something that has happened just recently because we've turned our attention to girls? And the answer is a pretty unequivocal no. So if we look at the long-term NAEP reading trends, you can see the same thing, these flat horizontal scores. Even when we zoom in the scale to look more closely, 17-year-olds on the long-term administration, they kind of go up and down, but as you can see, the gaps don't really open up all that much, and in some cases they actually get a little bit closer. So again, if we try to contextualize that with the long-term NAEP trends at age 17 for reading and math, you can see that in reading, those gaps are relatively large, approaching 15 points. Whereas for math, you can see that those scores are definitely trending downwards, much less than 5 points on the scale over time. And you can see those basically vertical lines that are drawn in there, the green one to the left and the blue one to the right, that the trend in math is a good bit more radical than the one for reading. But at the same time, you can kind of see that the scores are trending slightly down for both reading and math. We're getting much better at getting students to do well on these tests. So, just as we did for STEM, I want to make it a little bit more complex and try to introduce some notions of intersectionality. And when we talk about intersectionality, there's a common question, which boys? So it's not all boys that are struggling in reading. There are some very particular trends when we start breaking down this gender category into different kids. So in particular, race and class have a lot to do with reading scores. I'll show you some charts in just a second, but I also want to point out that there's a YouTube video from the Condition of Education, the Institute of Educational Sciences put out just not too long ago that has some really good sort of analysis of what's going on for males in general. But I'll show you some of the same kinds of charts that they do in that video. So if we look at racial and ethnic categories for the test, and again this is NAEP reading scores, and here I'm particularly looking at grade 8. Between whites and blacks, you can see over time that there has been a trend towards closing the gap. In 1992, it was 4 points higher than it was in 2015, but there are still some pretty major gaps in the scores between white and black students. If we look at whites and Hispanics, we see similar kinds of things going on. There has been a closing of the gap over the last 20 years or so, but you can see that there is still a pretty sizable gap that remains even though it has closed. If we look at First Nations people, so Native Americans and Native Alaskans, same kind of thing going on. Score differences between whites and First Nations peoples that are in the 20s, all of them statistically significant. And for Asians and Pacific Islanders, we have kind of the opposite story. It's kind of up and down. So you can see in some cases that Asian and Pacific Islanders are actually doing better than white students. But at other times across that history, they've been performing under the scores of white students. So that's some of the racial categories that we've looked at over time for NAEP scores. But what about class? Well, we have a proxy when we talk about class in school lunch data that can kind of tell us where incomes are for students. So if we look at NAEP reading scores and compare those students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch versus those students who are not eligible for free and reduced price lunch, you can see huge gaps open up again in the range of the mid-20s in terms of the score difference between those students who are eligible, that top line, and the students who are not eligible. So race and class really has a big impact on reading scores, much higher impact in terms of score difference than gender does. So to kind of contextualize those gaps, if we look at the average reading gap between 2003 and 2015, free and reduced price lunch is a 24-point gap. White versus black is a 27.3 point gap. But for boys versus girls, it's an 11-point gap. So again, class and race have a great deal more to do with score differences than just masculinity versus femininity. We can see the same kind of thing when we intersect both race and class and compare it with gender. So in this table, you can see for each racial category, we've got the average score on the 8th grade NAEP reading test. And you can see between males and females who are white, there's a gap. Between black males and females, there's a gap. Between Hispanic males and females, there's a gap, and so on and so forth. So every racial category, when we combine it with gender, you can see that there is a reading score gap, and it varies according to race. Some of them are relatively large, and some of them are about half in terms of the difference. So that's race and gender. If we look at race, income, and gender, we see basically the same kinds of things. So for white male students who are eligible for school lunch, they score lower on average than white female students who are eligible. White males who are not eligible for school lunch score much higher than white males who are eligible. So even within the category of male, you can see there's big differences between those scores. And if you take a look, for instance, at black students, right there, the third column over, who are eligible for free and reduced lunch, the black males in that category have the lowest scores of any racial group and income group. So the intersections of race, class, and gender for those students have a pretty dramatic impact on their reading scores. The one thing that I'd like you to take a sort of extra peek at is you can see that for First Nations peoples, Native Americans and Native Alaskans who are not eligible for school lunch, you can see that actually the trend is kind of reversed. And this is something I think actually to watch over time, because girls in this category, their scores have actually declined nearly 10 points over the last 5 years. So between the 2011 reading test and the 2015 reading test, their scores have gone down nearly 10 points. So really have to take a look at what might be going on for Native American and Native Alaskan girls who are also in low income status, or excuse me, not in low enough income status to get free and reduced lunch. So what about degrees? We talked about whether women get equal numbers of STEM degrees. Well, let's look at degrees for males and take a look at see if there's any kinds of trends that we can point out. Well, if we look at women's percentage of all college degrees, from associate's degrees to bachelor's degrees to master's degrees, all the way up to the doctorate, and look at it over a long historical period, you can see that there are definitely trends upwards for women. Now, there are dips in the trend lines that you can see, and we could ask some serious questions about, what historical events, what kind of social and economic events are going on that would cause dips like that. But in terms of the general trajectory, women have gotten more and more degrees across time. And so when we get to 2014, 2015, which is the far right of this chart, you can see that in every single college degree, women earn more as a percentage than do men. Well, what if we look at specific degrees? If you take a look at modern foreign languages and literature degrees, so things that are much more associated with literacy skill, and in this case, literacy skill in another language, you can see that on the left side, in around 1950, males are getting 80% of the foreign language and literature degrees for PhDs, a little more than half of the master's degrees, and about 40% of the bachelor's degrees. Over time, males are getting fewer and fewer of those. You can see kind of a bit of an uptick at this point, sort of hitting its valley at the early 2000s, and then the last data available for 2011, 2012, you can see kind of a small uptick in males' percentages of those degrees, but still well under half. Well, what about my discipline of education? You can see over time from 1950 to today that the general trend is again downwards for the percentage of degrees that males are getting. So at the 1950 mark, probably around 80% or so of the PhDs and about 60% or so of master's degrees and about half of bachelor's degrees are going to males. You can see some sharp declines going from about 1970 to 1980 and going downwards to where we are today. So now men earn fewer degrees in education at all levels, to the tune of about a third of the number that women earn. So that's the percentage of degrees, but if we look at the number of education degrees, it's a slightly more complicated picture. We can't always think in terms of percentages because that will fool us sometimes into thinking in terms of gender difference rather than a more complex picture. So if we look at bachelor's degrees, you can definitely see a downward trend, but spikes here and there. So around 1970, you see a spike in the number of education degrees that follows a general trend for all students getting more degrees starting in around 69 to 70. But ever since then, a lower and lower proportion of degrees or number of degrees going to men. So it is true to say that not only are they going lower in terms of the absolute percentage, but also the absolute number. Slightly different for master's degrees. You can kind of see an upward trend for master's degrees, starting from about 1950, where you're, along the lines of, 15 to 17,000 master's degrees in education. And that's been kind of going up and up with a dip towards 1990, but a pretty sharp rise around the early 2000s for master's degrees in education. Also, in terms of doctorate degrees in education, though men are a much smaller percentage of doctorate degrees, in terms of absolute numbers, it has varied over time, but the general trend has been towards them earning more. So what about a different kind of degree like English? This is what I got my bachelor's degree in. I taught English. It's another area where if you have issues for literacy skills, you would expect it to show up here, much like you would expect math issues for girls to show up in degrees in the STEM fields. And you can see that that's pretty much the case. Where starting in 1950, you've got 80% of the doctorates going to men in English. In just under 60% of the master's degrees and about half of the bachelor's degrees. In each case, the percentage of degrees going to men has gone down. Now, in English, less than 40% of all degrees are going to men. But again, if we look at the total number, a slightly more complex picture shows up. You can see a general trend upwards from the 50s to the 2010s, the early 2010s, towards more people getting actual degrees. But the male rate is slightly higher. You can see a very gentle slope across that amount of time, but there are more degrees actually going to men. It's just that women's degrees are growing at a faster rate. And that's kind of the trend overall. You can kind of see that male college enrollment is up overall. So don't let anybody tell you that men don't go to college anymore. It's just simply not true. You can see from 2000 to 2015 that there is an overall increase, and there's expected to be even more of an increase of the sheer numbers of males going to college. The issue really is that the female enrollment is up even more. So around between 1970 and 1980, you start to see women pulling further and further apart in terms of the sheer number and percentage of enrollments in college. So what about what that translates into? Is it that females have now overtaken males in the workforce and are getting paid more? Those kinds of issues? Unfortunately, the answer is no. So it's not the simple kind of answer that we sometimes expect about the payoff for education. You can see from this particular chart from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that weekly earnings for full-time wage and salary workers, 25 years and older, right? So full-time, not part-time. Nothing else explains it, like, taking off of work or any of those kinds of things. The educational attainment by gender simply doesn't pay off as much for women. So all of those blue lines that are lagging behind the green lines is women taking home less pay at every single degree level. So you can kind of look and see that in order for a woman to take home about as much as a man with a bachelor's degree does, she has to have a master's degree. To take home about as much as a man with a master's degree does, she has to have a doctoral degree. So at basically every step along the line, women tend to need at least one more degree than men do to earn the same amount of money. So going back to literacy, why the gender gap? Okay, so we've looked at degree outcomes and some of the financial outcomes. But if we go all the way back to this notion that males are not doing as well on tests of literacy performance what's going on there? Why is that happening? So there's a number of different reasons proposed, and we can, really kind of go through each and every one in much, much more detail. But here's just kind of the overview of what some people say. Well, one thing is socialization differences, that girls get read to more. When they get read to, there's much more interaction about looking at different words and those kinds of things. So how parents and grandparents and teachers socialize boys to regard reading. Other things might include gender differences in reading preferences, that boys like types of reading that are not necessarily valued in schools. So they might like things that are much more non-fictional, whereas in school we tend to choose in language arts classes much more fictional texts. So that notion that there's a kind of a bad fit between the way that boys like to read and the ways that they are asked to read in order to perform well at school. Another thing that comes up quite a lot is a lack of male reading role models, and that's both at home and at school. You'll constantly hear notions come up about that, kids don't have fathers at home. Of course, that is a gross stereotype that does not reflect the lives of many, 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 many boys. It's also one that doesn't necessarily jive with the number of men in their lives that are not necessarily their fathers, but who are influences that read and write and show boys that their literacy skills are important. Some people talk about the fact that reading is not really active or social enough. There's this notion that boys have to be active, that they want things to be exciting, and they want to be out of their seats and all those kinds of things, whereas reading is an activity that's solo, that requires them to sit still, all those kinds of things. So this notion that reading doesn't necessarily fit with the kind of habits of being a boy. And there's biological differences, and there are some brain differences. There are some hormonal differences. We've talked a good bit about what some of those differences happen to be. But the thinking here is that something about the brain makes them not be able to read quite as well as girls read. And the general criticism of this kind of proposed reason or proposed cause is that the average differences between boys and girls is very, very, very small. In fact, when you look at the average boy, he's very much more different from other boys than he is from other girls. So in other words, gender differences are much more stark within genders than between genders. And finally, another reason bring to the table about boys reading and why they don't either succeed as well at reading or don't really put as much attention and effort into reading is kind of an economic argument. This notion that boys don't actually need to read to be successful, that it's not a skill that necessarily pays off for them in the long run. And if you think back to that chart a few minutes ago with women needing an extra degree to earn the same amount of money, you can see where there might be some amount of credence that could be lent to that particular type of argument. In general, though, all of those particular arguments have some amount of validity that could be brought to them, some data that could be used to show that they have things about them. The much more likely thing to explain the reading gaps for boys is probably a combination of many of those different reasons. Life is complicated and lots of things interact, and not only just the intersections of race and gender, those kinds of things. But when we add in social forces that are pushing boys away from reading, economic forces that push boys away from reading, and a number of other dynamics that are pushing boys away from reading, it's probably wise to start looking at the intersections of those reasons and how those factors might interplay with each other to cause it.